opportunity to share with you today. This is going to be a bit of an intro, I suppose, in some ways, to a project I've been working on for a long time. It was the heart of my doctorate, but the doctorate was always done with a view to doing something that I kind of aspired to be valuable for the church. I think if you're ever going to do something as mad as doing a doctorate, you've got to have some kind of bright shining light that's going to guide you through the void of all of the hard research yards. For me, that was it. Sensing that I had a project that was potentially really of value. Certainly, for me, I've served as a pastor in various different ways in the past, and so have got a sense of, I guess, had a sense of how the project might fit in that environment, and that's the goal of what I want to do today. I'm just going to try and reorganize my screen here a bit, because I have an enormous picture of myself and tiny pictures of all of you, and that's not what I want. No, how do I do it? Okay, that's better. Now I've got an enormous picture of Tom, but that's much better. Cool. Okay, so let's just reorganization here. That's better. Good. Okay, so Tom's basically said 25 minutes of talking, 25 minutes of Q&A. I'm really happy to be quite flexible on that. So I will just kind of launch into an introduction to this. I hope to be able to kind of fill 25 minutes of stuff or more. The problem of having someone who's done a doctorate on the other end of the line is that it could take the rest of the week. So I will try to make it brief. But I'm really keen for you to interrupt me. So do whatever the appropriate way of doing that is, but it's probably a small enough room where you can just, interrupt in audio if you want to. I'll try to keep an eye on if there are any hands up or things like that. But Tom, if I miss anything, will you let me know? So where does all this start? The project I'm going to share with you began when I was doing a master's level class in Paul's letters, working through the letters to the Galatians, and coming to the part in Galatians 4, and you might want to turn to this. So Galatians 4:8, when Paul says this: "Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods. But now that you know God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you're turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You're observing special days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I may have wasted my efforts on you." I'm sure that little phrase is fairly familiar to all of us. The thing which is peculiar about it is when you try to overlay that on what we think the situation is that's actually happening in Galatia. So hopefully we're all roughly familiar with this. Galatia, we don't know exactly where these Galatian churches were. We could talk about that if you're interested. But certainly Asia Minor, probably South Central Asia Minor, maybe even South Asia Minor. But what we can be really sure about is that this is a congregation of former Gentiles. The big giveaway is that the letter is particularly focused on the question of whether they should or shouldn't get circumcised. That's not something you have to write to Jews. But there are all sorts of other reasons as you go through the nuances of the letter to believe that that's the audience. That's not really contested in the scholarship. So what's happened after Paul has planted these churches? It sounds like the sometimes past, it could be 18 months, it could be 3 years, it's probably not a decade. So it's a relatively recent church plant, relatively young believers probably still. Some newcomers have come, Jewish Christians who are encouraging these new pagan converts to keep the Jewish law. And hopefully all of that is kind of so far so good to us all. So I've already mentioned circumcision as a big issue. That's a shadow that's kind of hanging over the whole letter. In the section that we just read, we had this thing about special days and months and seasons and years. Again, that probably at least talks about Jewish Sabbaths and festival days and all that kind of thing. And so again, that would be relatively uncontested. Some people would argue that these people were already there. Some people would say that they were missionaries from Jerusalem. Scholarship is littered with different hypotheses for who they are. And actually, I think that turns out to be not particularly interesting or productive. But the question is, how can Paul say what I just said on that basis? If we have got former pagans who've become believers in Christ, who are now under influence from Jewish Christians to get circumcised, how can Paul accuse them of going back to something that they've done before? So he says, Now that you know God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you're turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? So there's this idea of regression to something with which the Galatians are already familiar. And hopefully we're thinking, hold on a minute, they want to get circumcised. In what way can that be regressing to something they've done before? Augustine amusingly throws his hands up in horror at this point and basically goes, what? Like circumcision is something that you can't really do. Again, it's of the nature of the thing. And it turns out, if we think that that is just some sort of aberration here in Galatians 4, it actually turns out to be thematic for the whole letter. So familiar text, Galatians 5:1, it's for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Ask yourself why the again is even needed in that sentence. Or think, as you go back through the letter, we have going back from there, immediately before that, we have the Hagar and Sarah story. So this is a story about not going back to where you're from, isn't it? Not going back to being sons of the slave woman, now that you have become sons of the free woman. Think about what's happening earlier on in Galatians 4, as we have these two kind of analogies, one which is about progressing from slavery to freedom, much like the Hagar story. The other is about moving from airship, and I don't mean airship as in a balloon that's floating in the sky, but airship as in the state of being in air, moving from airship to being actually the inheritor, the master of the estate. And in each one of those cases, Paul says, having got to that kind of destination state, why do you want to go back to being in transit towards it? So it's a really perplexing feature of this letter. In what possible way can Paul think that his readers are going back, given that they are being encouraged to become more Jewish? And there are a whole different bunch of ways in which I suppose this question, people have tried to resolve it. And it may just seem like a kind of like an abstruse New Testament puzzle. What I want to try and show you is that this is massively relevant to what we think the gospel is, really important to the way that we interpret the letter, very important then for the way that we would preach it. And I think really exciting in terms of securing and then helping us to kind of engage with maximum enthusiasm and kind of contemporary relevance on this historic truth of justification by faith, which is so central to the letter. So what I'm going to try and do is just join up the dots between the problem I've described and that set of kind of benefits, hopefully, that we can get to. And then I'll invite you to push and pull at it and see what you think is happening. Okay, so possible ways that you might explain this. One way to do it would be to say, look, these guys are in maybe South Central Asia Minor, and there are already Jews in this region. So even if they are pagans kind of by ethnic extraction, they already may have some substantial experience of Judaism. And a place that you would go for this would obviously be Acts and the first missionary journey. I think it's quite likely that these Galatian churches are actually churches that were founded on the first missionary journey. Again, I could have a chat with you later about why I think that's the case. I think there are some clues in the text. And also, I think when you start to assemble Paul's larger chronology, you're kind of forced in that direction. But again, we could talk about that more. And on the first missionary journey in Acts, when we start having a look at it, we realize that Paul is dropping into synagogues all the time. So that's Paul's first port of call. And he actually meets Gentiles in the synagogues. And it seems like this is a pretty regular kind of thing to happen in this period, in this part of the world. And now archaeology broadly supports this, the idea that synagogues in the first century had a kind of penumbra of Gentile attendees, people looking on in interest. And you can kind of see why. In first century pagan religious culture, people are assembling kind of portfolios of religious threads to create their own kind of custom set of devotions. So they might have a little bit of Zeus worship, a little bit of Artemis, maybe focus on some particular local deity who is kind of the patron of I don't know, fertility or something in the town where the person lives. But then they're always going to be interested in, but what about Asclepius, kind of interesting new god coming from the east? What about maybe Judaism? That sounds incredibly interesting in that it's so historic. And wow, they write backwards and they have all these kind of strange, interesting things. So you find people appropriating bits of Judaism, and that seems to be something that's happening. One of the particularly attractive things of integrating Judaism into your religious portfolio is it justifies having one day off a week. That was a big deal for people like, oh, I'm a little bit Jewish and I like to have a Sabbath off. And in wider Greco-Roman culture, you can see people being very sniffy about that. It's like, oh, so many people are kind of embracing Judaism these days in order to get the fringe benefits. But the problem with that, so this is what we call, this is the God-fearer phenomenon. The idea that you've got people who are interested in Jewish worship, attending, welcomed into Jewish synagogues. But the thing that you start to realize when you dig away at God-fearers is that the thing that they don't do is they get circumcised. Getting circumcised is a statement of exclusive religious commitment to the God of Israel. An exclusive religious commitment is the thing that God-fearers are not trying to do. And there are all kinds of reasons why they wouldn't do that. To exclusively commit yourself to the God of Israel is to decommit yourself from devotion to the Roman emperor, to decommit yourself from worship to your local gods, which is actually kind of part of the social contract of the period. If you suddenly decide that you're going to hit the eject button from worshipping the local deity when harvest time comes around and the crops fail, everyone's going to blame you. So there are all kinds of reasons to hang on to your existing religious commitments alongside Judaism. So if that's the background, the problem with trying to explain Galatians that way is that you can't say Paul's readers are going back to that. The problem in Galatia is that they are embracing circumcision. They're embracing a full-on exclusive commitment to this foreign God. So going back can't be resolved that way. So then you might ask yourself, I mean, there are all kinds of other attempts to deal with it in the scholarship. Some people would say Paul is just doing a rhetorical kind of making a rhetorical move here, just saying like, what you're doing is as bad as going back to paganism. But for various reasons, I don't think that really works. Again, we could talk about that in Q&A. But what I want to do now is tell you what I think is happening and then explain why I think it's relevant and how it helps us then handle the letter as preachers. So in order to get this, I think you need to try to step back into what it would have been like to be one of Paul's converts. So let's imagine that we are Greco-Roman pagans, and we have, from our earliest memory, from our mother's knee, we've been steeped in the religions of the Greco-Roman world until Paul showed up and gave us his very different thing. And what this looks like, and one of the reasons why, actually, to be honest, just to that, I can't tell left and right here, but one of those two big bookcases behind me is basically all stuff on Greco-Roman religion of Asia Minor. So this is the sentence that of doing the doctorate, that you have to read all these abstruse books and inscriptions. It was actually really fascinating. But when you start to get into understanding the kind of religious norms that are present in this period and in this place, you find that actually it's not that it is atheistic, certainly not. They call Asia Minor the land of 1,000 gods in this period. And it is not hedonistic particularly either, or not without, maybe the better way to say it is not without ethical constraints at all. Actually, a lot of these little local cults are very uptight about ethics, about ritual purity, about the state in which you can or cannot enter the sanctuary of the local god. There are all kinds of festivals that you must comply with, a fixed religious calendar with certain things that you must attend. And if you don't attend them, you will end up being seen to be letting the side down in your society. And then particularly interesting, there is a really prevalent practice of what we call votive offerings. So this is basically the idea that you will kind of make promises and pledges to the gods and authenticate them with these little kind of dedicatory offerings, little lumps of stone. So the way that it would work, let's say it's planting time and you own a small holding in South Central Asia Minor, and you are interested, as you should be, in the prosperity of your fields and getting a good harvest. You might go down to the local temple and kind of, I don't want to stress the transactionalness of this too much. I don't think that the people really thought that they were kind of equal bargaining partners with the gods. They always realized that they were kind of subservient. But nonetheless, there is a kind of bargaining behavior that you see where someone will go to the god and say, if you give me a great harvest, I will come back with some kind of offering, which I will establish in your temple, which will kind of declare your praise. And this is what the votives are. So at the end of the season, when the harvest has been bountiful, you come back with your little fragment of stone, which has got scrawled on it, Asclepius is the most amazing God ever, because when I asked him to give me an abundant harvest, he did. Lots of love, Tom Underhill, or something like that. And the way that they work, it's very interesting. These votives actually all have a common physical format. They have a little tenon that sticks off the bottom of the stone. And in the temples, opposite the statues of the gods, you see these shelves, which have got like matching indentations in them. So the idea is that you would come and you would slot your votive into the shelf, which is directly opposite the god. And because the god is a statue, they can't do anything other than look at it. So it's a way of kind of making sure that you've got the attention of the god. Like, you made a promise to me and you were faithful and I was thankful. I'm kind of in your good books. So that's the religious world that these people inhabit. And we could talk a little bit more about that. So if you imagine that is the setting, that's what everybody knows about religion in Asia Minor when Paul arrives. Imagine what would happen. So Paul has obviously come along and he's given them this incredible gospel of grace. He's given them this message that actually there's nothing that you need to do and nothing that you could do in order to draw the attention of the God of Israel towards you. But God, out of mercy, has taken the initiative. He's moved towards you. He has found a way to bring you into relationship with him. And that's, by the way, your fundamental problem. You're estranged from the God who made you. So that's Paul's message. But then imagine 18 months, 2 years, 3 years on, Paul is, off on other travels. And, now you're in the situation where maybe the harvests have been good, but maybe they haven't. There's a lot of social pressure from your neighborhood now to say, oh, you ought to be doing the right thing in terms of, gardening your relationships with the gods. And now a bunch of enthusiastic Jewish Christians come along and say, well, if you want to be a real Christian, you need to keep the feasts, you need to be ritually pure, i.e. not eating the wrong things. You need to make sure that you get circumcised, which is a very costly offering that you can make to the gods. And you just have to ask yourself, how would that have been interpreted? And I think it's really probable that the way that would have been interpreted is just according to exactly the same pattern of thought which had dominated their religious past. And so I think the problem here in Galatia is that when these Jewish teachers come along, and I'd say that this is important, whatever those Jewish teachers thought they were doing, the way that it was received would have been a mirror, or something like a mirror, of the Galatians' past reception of their previous religious ideas. That may sound like kind of science fiction, so let me kind of demonstrate it to you. Actually, this is a really big issue throughout Paul's writing. So if you turn to 1 Corinthians 8, watch what happens when Paul deals with the question that comes from the Corinthian church about food sacrificed to idols. So we've got this question coming from the strong in Corinth. Can we take our recently converted Christian friends down to the idol temple? And obviously the strong in Corinth think you can. And Paul basically affirms them initially and says, look, theologically, I'm on the same page as you guys. We're all monotheists now. But then it's very interesting what he does. In verse 7, he then says, so this is 1 Corinthians 8, verse 7, but not everyone possesses this knowledge. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat sacrificial food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to a god. And since their conscience is weak, it's defiled. So it's interesting, isn't it, what's happening there? It's not that these people are any less monotheistic in their convictions than the strong. It's not that they haven't responded positively to the gospel that Paul brought to Corinth. But the problem is habituation to a different set of norms in their past. And Paul is smart enough as a pastor to know that habituation is going to reassert itself. It's like a physical reflex. If you put them in that situation once again, they will find themselves doing and thinking exactly what they always used to do and think, whether they want to or not. And I think that's what's happening in Galatia. And there's another example that you could go to in Romans. So if that's the model, let me just try and show you why I think that's important. And then we can then jump into conversation about this whole idea. So imagine that this is basically what's going on here, that actually the underlying problem in Galatia is to do with the long shadow of Paul's converts' religious past, that they are struggling to shed that set of habituated reflex reactions to religious stuff. It seems, doesn't it, as you read through Galatians and through other New Testament there, it gives us several windows on Paul's missionary practice. It seems that Paul is very light when he goes into these contexts, like when he goes to Corinth. He says, I resolve to do nothing except preach Christ crucified. Part of what's going on there, I think, is trying to make sure that he doesn't in any way kind of reactivate or reanimate or give a new kind of context in which their previous religious thinking can flourish. So he wants to go in there and just give them something very, very simple. He wants to give them his gospel. And that gospel, as we all know, is characterized by and focused around this truth that a person, and this is Galatians 2:15 and 16, that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. This is the heart of what Paul wants to say. And what I'm going to try and show you here is, I think, historically, that's been seen as the center of Paul's message here in Galatians. And I think that's exactly what it is. So maybe when we chat later, we can talk about how what I'm doing here, dialogues with old and new perspectives and what it does with them. That would certainly be a really interesting conversation to have. But if you think about what actually happens there in Galatians 2, the way that's introduced is very interesting. This is where Paul is in dialogue with Peter in Antioch, and Paul's reflecting back on this very kind of spiky confrontation that takes place. As Paul is trying to persuade Peter, actually the thing that he ought to do is continue to kind of embrace fellowship with these Gentile Christians in Antioch. When Paul confronts him, he turns to Peter and he says, "We who are Jews by birth and not sinful Gentiles know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ." Now, most of us, and I would include me before I got going on all this, would assume that what's going on there is a contrast between Christianity and Judaism, that Paul is saying Christians think that people are justified by faith, and Jews, like I used to be, think that you're justified by works. And Paul's trying to urge Peter up out of that Jewish past and encourage him to embrace his new Christian present. But if you look at the words, it doesn't actually say that. It says, "We who are Jews by birth, ... know that a person is not justified by the works of the law." It seems to be Paul is saying, look, it's actually intrinsic to Judaism, or at least Jewish Christianity as Paul and Peter know it, to not think that God can be attracted towards us by our works. And actually, as you go on through Galatians, you find that he means that for Judaism as a whole, because in Galatians 3, he's going to take Abraham as his example and say Abraham was justified by faith. And actually, that whole story of justification by faith is running right through the Old Testament and all terminating and landing on Christ. So again, this would be a great thing to chat about. But I think Paul's thesis here is to say, actually, Jews are the people who are privileged here. It's possible, whether we're Jews or Gentiles, to get bent out of shape on this and persuade ourselves that actually salvation is by works, in whatever way you mean that. But Paul, I think, is trying to say, look, if you're a Jew, you should know better. If you're a Jew with the Abrahamic story in your background, with the Deuteronomic testimony in your background, you should know that God didn't choose the Jews because they were more righteous or more, attractive. He loved them because he loved them, and the Jews should know it. But the interesting thing, isn't it, is that what Paul, the way that he frames it, he says, "We who are Jews by birth and not sinful Gentiles know." And so here's the problem of the letter, isn't it, in Galatians 2? It's the Gentiles who don't have this. They don't have this kind of inbuilt set of protections that come from a Jewish background telling them, oh no, there's no possible way that you could draw the God of Israel towards yourself. The only way that relationship with him could be restored would be if he reached out and you put faith in his initiative. And so the problem in Galatia is what happens when, for whatever reason, Jewish laws are offered to Gentiles. And Paul says, look, these sinful Gentiles, that's quite a conventional way for a Jew like Paul to talk about Gentiles. Their problem is that they don't have any of those protections. And so if you give them laws to keep, they will assume that those laws will do for them what their laws have always done, that they'll draw the gods to them, that they'll make it more likely that God will like them, that God will bless them, that God will forgive them. So I think this is really, really exciting. Because basically what this gives you, I don't know whether you're in the same boat as me here. I used to find Galatians a difficult letter to get to grips with, because it felt to me like it was addressing a problem that I didn't really have. I didn't feel particularly tempted to get circumcised. And it felt like the legalism that he was speaking about was something that, I don't know what, I think we can all be aware that we have legalisms in our life, but it felt like the main application of the letter was, oh, well, just be careful not to try and turn your quiet time into a way of making you think like you've earned God's favor. But actually what's going on here, I think, is much more radical. If you see that what Paul's doing is trying to defend Gentiles against the idea that you can make God like you, then, that I think travels into our world with so much more relevance. Obviously, we don't have temples of Artemis or Asclepius or Zeus. Hopefully we don't kind of float it. Not even here in Oxford, I don't think we've got any of those. But if you think what those people were trying to do, that relationship that I described to you between these Galatians and their gods in the past was always about trying to make the future give you what you want, doing things in the present that can make your harvest good, making offerings which can maximize your chances of blessing in the future and minimize the chances of cursing and disadvantage. Well, isn't that just a portrait of Western culture? We're always doing things to try to make the future give us what we want, with our money, with our social networks, with our friendships, with our education and our CVs. It's all about trying to make investments in the present that will give us some sense of a right to what comes next. But Paul is trying to say, look, if that's baked into your Christianity, that's not Christianity at all. Christianity is this radical stance that says, no, actually, we believe that we are totally dependent on God, that God is the initiative taker, that he is the one who gets to say what it is that's good for us and what it is that we receive from him. He is the one who reaches out to make relationship between us and him, again, all on the basis of what Christ achieves in our place. And for me, that preaches really powerfully, because I think it helps people see that this is speaking right into the norms of our culture and our thought. And also maybe, it's kind of frightening as well, I think. It makes me ask as a minister, to what extent is my Christianity and my preaching actually still working with habituated reflexes that come out of my past or out of my culture? And it also makes me think, okay, even where that isn't the case, how much does my preaching or the practice of our church unwittingly reactivate things which come out of the culture or out of people's past? And so even though my intentions are good, it's possible that the Jewish Christians who are actually causing the trouble here may have had good intentions in some of this, and we can talk about that. Even though my intentions are good, it may be that what I'm doing by preaching my, here are my 3 beautiful application points about how to live the Christian life, someone may receive that through the medium of self-help, kind of the genre of self-help, not because I'm teaching it that way, but that's the culture they're immersed in. And so it may come out to them as a whole load of works that I do in order to please God, even if I don't intend it that way. So I think just realizing that we have a responsibility to understand where our people are coming from, what their dominant thought forms are, what they're habituated to, and to try to make sure as much as possible that we don't just teach the gospel effectively, but we kind of guard and steward the way that it's received, I think is all here in this letter. So it's full of challenge and interest. That's probably a good place to stop. Hopefully that's going to raise a whole bunch of questions, because it gets to what I think is a very recognizable reformed reading of this letter, but it gets there in a very unusual way.
Thank you very much, Neil. That's fantastic. We'll go to Q&A. It's open mic, so just unmute yourself or drop something in the chat if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll go from there. I wanted to ask Neil if you could maybe tease out a little bit. You said that's kind of quite close to a reformed reading of Galatians, where you would feel the distinction really is. I mean, is it kind of that a reformed reading would read the opponents in Galatia and say a kind of Pelagian works righteousness is there in the Pharisees, or some kind of contemporary perversion of Judaism? So kind of, boo, don't do that, but you're saying that's not what's going on. Is that the distinction, or you?
Yeah, so I mean, I wouldn't even want to say it's close to a reform reading. I would say it is a reform reading of Galatians. You know, what the reformers were seeking to do with Galatians was to really grab hold of and celebrate the centrality of justification by faith, the idea that God is the initiative taker, that faith is our spirit-enabled means by which we take hold of the grace that God offers us. And I think all of that is absolutely here. I think if you were to think about Luther in particular, so Luther sees in the Galatian letter a mirror of his own interaction with medieval Catholicism. And so for Luther, when he looks at, so there are lots of different words that are used for them, but let's call them the agitators, the troublemakers, the people who are causing the problem in Galatia. And they really are causing problems. They're no friends of Paul. They seem to have big questions about whether he's even really an apostle. So let's not be any doubt there are big issues here. Paul talks about the fact that, you know, in the introduction to the letter, he talks about them throwing people into confusion and trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. That's pretty bold language. So however we read them, we need to make sure that we accommodate what Paul does actually tell us. But what Luther does with them is he basically wants to say, look, these are essentially, peddlers of works righteousness on the model of the medieval Catholics that he was opposed to. And so he reads back from his Catholic kind of surroundings back into first century Judaism and basically says that must be what the Jews were. Now, this brings us into, I guess, the classic debate between old and new perspective, because the core contention of the new perspective is just to say, look, there isn't much evidence that Jews were systemically like that in the first century. And I don't think anybody has really effectively dealt with that. The Justification and Variegated Nomism series of books, I think in some ways rather proves that, rather than kind of fundamentally damaging it. I think that I think it's a human trait to find ways to justify ourselves in the sight of God. And we shouldn't be surprised to see it among Jews, and we shouldn't be surprised to see it among ourselves and among our non-Christian neighbors. It's just something that human beings do. But I don't think, and I think this is probably where Luther was in error, I don't think it's right to suggest that there is some kind of genetic propensity among Jews towards works righteousness. Actually, what Paul seems to say in Galatians 2 is rather the opposite, that Jews, like everybody else, are just completely ordinary fallen humans, but that Jews, because of the legacy of teaching that they've received, should know better. They should know that actually that's not the way that the divine human relationship is going to happen. So I would want to be kind of radically in agreement with the reformers in terms of what they say about the centrality of justification and what it actually is, because the problem where the new perspective has gone, so I'm thinking here about particularly Tom Wright and James Dunn, there are multiple new perspectives out there. They ask themselves the question, they say, oh, well, if Judaism in the first century wasn't kind of intrinsically legalistic, what is the problem that Paul's dealing with here? And their answer is that Judaism essentially is nationalistic. Judaism has very fixed boundaries around its communities in terms of what does or doesn't make you a member, what does or doesn't constitute belonging. And so they would say the problem in Galatians is that you've got Jews showing up saying, oh, well, if you want to follow the God of Abraham, you've got to do what all the other followers of the God of Abraham have always done, which is get circumcised, keep the feasts, be ritually pure, eat the right things, ... And what Wright and Dunn are saying is that those are the boundaries, those are the kind of the boundary markers that define the community of people who follow Abraham's God. And so when you come to a passage like Galatians 2, they would say justification means a justified sense that I really am a member of the family, that I really am a member of this, community of worshippers. But that's a very different thing from what the reformers thought it was. They're talking about membership of a community of human beings, whereas the reformers were talking about reconciliation with the God who made us, from whom we are estranged. And so I think the reformers are absolutely right there. But I think the way that they got there, or certainly that Luther got there, the collateral damage was a kind of demonization of Judaism, of saying, look, in the first century, Judaism had become corrupt. And I don't actually think that you can really justify that from the literary legacy of the period. And it would be tragic, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it, if it was true? You know, Paul seems to be able to assume here that Jews know that the Abrahamic story is the paradigm of how God interacts with human beings, and that story is cashed out in Jesus. You know, it would be a tragedy if actually the entire Jewish community around him had basically completely lost track with that underlying truth.
Neil.
John.
Hi, good to see you.
Hi, good to see you.
So just for my clarity of mind, so you're saying that when Paul talks about works of the law, he is talking about a legalism, but he's applying that to the Gentile worldview rather than the Jews. So it's a sort of a reformed understanding of the opposite gospel.
Yeah. So his problem with the works of the law is what you think they do. If you think that by doing legally observant actions, you make God like you, you've got a big problem. But the problem with the reform view here, and again, so I'm kind of throwing together here like an absurd stereotype of the old perspective. I don't know whether anybody out there actually believes this, you know, but if you basically assume that the problem in Galatia is that Jews are fundamentally legalistic, and that the law for Paul is something which is now toxic, like after the road to Damascus, he just can't go there. The problem that you've got is actually, even in the letter itself, you've got text that you just can't handle. So what is Paul doing, sharing the right hand of fellowship in Galatians 2, 9 and 10 with law observant Jewish Christians? Acts clearly tells us that that's what they were. You know, in Acts 21 we hear James saying, look, I've got thousands of law observant Jewish Christians here in my congregation. We have Paul elsewhere in the New Testament taking a Nazirite vow, Paul submitting to synagogue discipline. That's what the 39 lashes are all about. We have Paul, I mean, the classic example is Acts 21, when he comes back from the end of the third missionary journey. We're told that those thousands of law observant Jews have heard that Paul is the person who tells Jews not to circumcise their children. And as good kind of like sons of the Reformation, we're thinking this is where Paul's going to stick it to them, right? And he's going to say, yeah, that's right. The law is over. You don't have to circumcise your children anymore. But Paul doesn't do it. He totally won't play that game. So he actually says, no, I don't say that at all. Let me prove it to you. And he goes down to the temple and participates in legal observances to prove it. So you've got real problems if you want to kind of, and also, I mean, Paul circumcises Timothy. What in the world is that about? If circumcision is kind of like this ghastly legacy of a toxic religious past. So the goal of the project is really to try and help us essentially exegete the letter well, to try to apply the analogy of scripture to make sure that we're interpreting each part in the light of all the other parts. And Galatians is just, unless you've got a bit of sophistication, Galatians is very, very difficult to handle that way. You know, what do you do with Galatians 5? So just quickly turn to Galatians 5, 2-6. So here Paul begins, mark my words, I tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Like, that is a very, very bold thing to say. And then in verse 4, you who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ, you've fallen away from grace. I mean, that's dramatic apostasy language. And yet in verse 6, he then says, for in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. And you're left thinking like, what? Like, how can those things possibly belong in the same person's life, let alone in the same paragraph? You know, so you've got to have some nuance here. And the way that the reading that I'm giving you kind of resolves it would be to say, look, if you Gentiles let yourselves be circumcised, this is what it's going to do to you. It's going to reactivate all of these kind of habitual behaviors that make you think that you can make God love you. And that's the reason why it's going to lead to apostasy, because that is apostasy, isn't it? If you believe you can make God love you, you've not grasped the gospel. Like, that's a fatal step in terms of Christian regression development, however you want to say it. But the reason why he can say, look, in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has had any value, is that the act itself is totally neutral. It's all a question of what it does to you, of what you think it's accomplishing. And so what Paul wants them to do is have an ethos that says, look, whether I work or whether I don't work, the thing which is important is God's initiative and my response in faith. It's not that I can make him favor me, or I can maximize my chances of blessing or minimize my chances of cursing by performing these or those actions. God is sovereign. He's our shepherd. He leads us where he wills. And it's our responsibility as his sheep to follow him, trusting that he knows what he's doing. So that's the way that the reading kind of resolves those inner tensions. It's interesting, actually, it puts a real stress then on spiritual transformation, doesn't it? Which is such a big emphasis throughout Paul. So as you go through the letter, what you find is Paul starts to talk about gifts of the Spirit. He starts to talk about maturity. And I think what he's going for here is to say, look, I don't want you recently converted Galatians to stay in this incredibly fragile place where if anybody gives you a Jewish law to keep, you suddenly start acting like you used to. I think what he's looking for is to see them actually develop and grow to the point where they are mature enough to handle participation in a Jewish synagogue if they needed to, in order to win people for the gospel. This is Paul's own model, isn't it? So in Corinth, he talks about in the Corinthian letters, he talks about being able to be a Jew to the Jews and a Gentile to the Gentiles in order to save some. But this, for me, is just fantastically convicting for us as pastors, I think. Because if you think about what we do, I think we're in a completely opposite place to where Paul is. So our model of Christian maturity is this, or sadly, this is what I think it is. You can tell me, I'm sure your churches wouldn't do anything this ridiculous. But we think if we've got a brand new convert in our hands, we think, oh, the kind of event this person's going to need is as much like the world as possible. Let's kind of ease the transition in. Let's have lots of kind of, seeker sensitive stuff. The whole church movement's been based on this idea that what you need to do with people who are interested is make it palatable by making it similar to what happens now. Now, I think Paul would be completely freaking out at this point, because the very thing that he most wants for people who have just got into it is the opportunity for them to separate themselves from their existing habitual norms, so that they don't end up kind of rewriting them, creating a faith which has a Christian exterior, but basically still has all the same apparatus they used to use. So he's looking kind of for a radical break at that point. And we might be thinking, if we're not seeker sensitive churches, like, oh, good for us, we're fine. We never bought into it. We never played U2 as our kind of like introit to the church service, that kind of thing. But actually, we get it wrong the other end as well, because what I think we do is that when Christians are mature, our churches kind of sanction the idea that it's possible to live in this totally Christian bubble, this world of weird language, of weird books, of weird behavior, which has nothing to do with the world at all, that isn't engaged with it, that doesn't listen to what it listens to, that can't relate to it or be related to by it. And again, I think Paul would just be freaking out at that point as well, because for Paul, isn't the purpose of maturity that you can engage the world safely? That seems to be what Paul's saying about spiritual transformation. The destination for him is that you're able to be a Jew to the Jew and a Gentile to the Gentiles. So the whole goal of our discipleship, of trying to move people towards this place where they have left behind all of these reflexes of a non-Christian past. And I think we need to be not too optimistic about how much we've even done that ourselves. But if that is the goal, what it's for is that we're then able to actually engage sympathetically with people of other views without it then having a toxic, destructive effect on our own faith. So I just think that as churches, we're almost completely round the wrong way on this, that we need to pay much more attention to trying to gently help new converts up out of the way of thinking from which they've come. And then we need to be much more deliberate about trying to usher our mature believers into reading, thinking, and engaging actively with the thought models that are prevalent in the culture around us, so that we can be effective welcomers, evangelists, attractive, relatable models of the gospel.
Neil.
Ash.
So just off the back of what you're saying there, I suspect that if we were shooting from the hip, most of us, if we saw the application here to be, we need to, when we have a new convert, help them escape not only the mindset of what's gone on, but look for anything in their lives that might trigger a a return down a particular road.
Yeah.
I suspect most of us would accidentally, if we were just reacting, end up doing something that looked a little bit like cult conditioning.
Right.
So what would be a Pauline, or more broadly biblical, way of enacting that?
Yeah, great question. So I totally hear what you're saying. And this is one of the reasons why I want to do the session that we're doing today. Is it's great to have the opportunity to float this with people who are in ministry and just say, you know, what would this look like? Because I certainly don't think that I'm any kind of expert in it. I think one of the key things here is just awareness. So I think what Paul is going for here is awareness of the issue. He wants us to be aware that becoming a Christian doesn't just instantly make you a tabula rasa, but that you carry with you certain reflexes from your religious past or from your culture. And just being able to be alert to that fact and talk about it, I think, is a very large part of the battle. So the cult conditioning thing doesn't go for awareness. It actually is specifically not trying to make people aware of what's happening. It tries to go just kind of immersing people in a kind of world and in a behavior that cuts them off from what's happened before and not telling them why. But Paul is totally the opposite of that. Paul wants us to be really cognizant of the fact, and actually almost cognition of it is almost enough, that we are still trying to escape from a set of dominant religious norms. And I mean that even for people coming out of a secular background, that's still a set of religious norms in Paul's terms. We need to be aware of that. We need to be able to talk about that. We need to be able to discuss it and talk about how we handle and combat them. Now, I mean, it is interesting if you look back through the history of the church. So this reading is by no means new. So if you go back to Oregon, you'll find this all over the place. If you go back to Ignatius, you find him talking in this way about regression in this letter. The Oregon one is really interesting, actually. When Oregon is trying to explain the Exodus story and why the Jews want to go back to Egypt, he goes to Galatians in order to explain it. And he basically says, look, we have habituated religious reflexes which come out of a world that we've been embedded in, and we can't stop ourselves doing it. So when he thinks the Israelites want to go back to Egypt, it's the golden calf. They don't want to physically go back to Egypt, but they want to remake Egyptian religion with the God of Israel as the notional target. So what's interesting, though, about when you go back into that patristic period is you find people like Cyprian of Carthage. Their whole model for embracing new Christians is actually they don't even let them get baptized or take communion for like 3 years or something. I'm not saying we should do this, but they take really seriously just trying to socialize people with the ideas of Christianity and get to the point where there is at least real competition in their minds and practice for what actually is the right thing. What's the right way to react to a religious ritual? What's the right way to react to the idea that, you know, there are offerings that you can or you might not make to the gods? And only after they've done that, let them loose on the actual material of Christian worship. And so I think your warning is absolutely right. But I think at the moment we're so swung over onto the other side where we just kind of assume, oh, you're a new Christian, brilliant, clean slate, what should we build? But I think as pastors, we need to say, oh, you're a new Christian. What are we building on? What's under the ground? Let's just do our listening work. Let's do our, like, what kind of sheep are you? You know, and where have you been grazing in the past? And so what have you got used to? And what are you likely to go back to because of that? Before we just immediately say, oh, great, new sheep, perfect, let's go there. So I just think it's a call to us as pastors to listen rather than to be kind of cult manipulators.
Neil, can I just ask, I'm coming from a very different perspective to everybody else on this call, but thank you so much. I'm just thinking, as an analogy, you know, in child development, anybody that has children, you get these massive developmental stages. Mm-hmm. Perhaps a toddler is just learning to walk. Yeah. And then an event happens, maybe they get a cold or a sick bug and they're ill. And what you almost always see them doing is they'll go back a few stages in development and do they find security in what was familiar to them. So they'll often go back to crawling until they feel more scaffolded and stable, and then they run, not walk. Yeah. And I'm just thinking about what you've said in that context, and also perhaps in the context of the letter to the Hebrews, you know, that this warning, persecution has come, and the temptation is they're going to go back to what they knew was really familiar, because there's kind of a certainty and security in what is familiar, isn't it? So is that kind of, sorry, I came in late, is that sort of what you're saying in this, that there's this sort of propensity in all of us, whether Jew or Gentile, there's this familiarity and comfort in what we habitually know and are most familiar with, and therefore that lens of what we're perceiving things through is always the easiest path, or almost, is what is going to take us back there. Is that what you would say?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I think it's a really perceptive remark, and in some ways, you know, what I'm doing here is really kind of almost blindingly obvious from a psychological perspective. We all have kind of inbuilt patterns that have formed through our experiences in the past. And you're right, those are the paths of least resistance. We find those easy to go back to. And so I think it's really helpful to see sometimes moments of difficulty will push you back onto past patterns. I mean, this is so obvious, isn't it? But, you know, if someone is a smoker and they've kicked it, but if they then suddenly one day they find that they've just been let go from their job, out will come the cigarettes. Like, it's so easy to go back in those kinds of moments. And I think we just have to be alert to that as pastors. I use a silly illustration. Maybe this would be a good one to finish with, because I know that you guys are almost out of time. But to try to explain what's going on in Galatia, I mean, this is, I don't by any means think that the agitators in Galatia are as positive as the pitch that I'm about to give, but I think it's a helpful picture nonetheless, even though it's slightly swung over to one side. If we as a whole group, after having this call, were to get together later on this evening, and I don't know where the nearest city would be, but let's say Bath is our nearest kind of city that we can all go to, and we all get an invite to go to an open meeting of Bath Alcoholics Anonymous, and Alcoholics Anonymous kind of kicks off at 5:30, and it gets into the circle, and we're all sitting kind of round the circle listening. And I hope as Christians we would all be profoundly moved and kind of upset at the stories we would hear of alcohol and what it can do in terms of destroying relationships and jobs and, family and all that kind of stuff. You can imagine some bright spot, let's say it's me, at 7 o'clock when the meeting ends, just saying, look, thank you so much for inviting us. It's been brilliant to be here, but we're also really just heartbroken and moved to see what's happened. And we can really see these conversations are making loads of progress. And it's only 7 o'clock. Let's just go around the corners to the pub and keep talking. And in that moment, just out of a genuine kind of compassion for the progress of the person, you could send every single person in that room back into the abyss. And I think that this is the kind of thing that Paul's thinking. I think actually the agitators may be much less well-meaning than the little group that I've just imagined. But I don't think we have to believe that they are fully signed up for works righteousness, to not perceive the danger, the acute danger of what it is that they're doing. So I think the fundamental problem of the letter is actually a pastoral problem. I think that they're naive. They don't understand the implications of taking Jewish law back to these people. They may have had all kinds of reasons for wanting them to be Jewish, but to be legally observant. Some of them may be good, some of them may be bad. They may have been quite a lot like Paul theologically. They may have been very different. But the point is that if you give people all of these kind of works to do, you're not necessarily in control of them doing them the way that you would. They may do them the way that they used to, particularly, as you said so helpfully, if they're under some kind of pressure. And we better believe these people were. Actually, it was not easy to be a Christian, in one of these churches in the first century. So easy to go back to what you knew. So yeah, I just offer that to you. I think it gives us a really exciting set of tools with which to engage Galatians, but also Paul more widely, as you start to see just what a sophisticated pastor he is, how he's thinking astutely about the psychology of the pastoral encounter. And I think it gives us all kinds of marching orders. And if you're interested, so this is all partly the reason why Tom asked me to do this, and partly the reason why I've managed to ad-lib the whole thing, is that it's coming as a book now for IVP. So the thesis is a kind of a big tome that is in a library type book. But my goal has always been to do something that's much more accessible and kind of, read on the beach, adventure story type version. So hopefully you got a little bit of a glimpse of that today. The book is called Galatians Reconsidered, and it's coming out with IVP in September. So if you're interested and you want to take your time over what I've just scampered through, then grab yourself one of those.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Neil. Very stimulating, very helpful. I'm sure we're all very thankful to you for squeezing us in to your lunchtime and giving us the shortened version of your book. The book's obviously coming out. That's great. Have you written anywhere else on this at popular level, kind of articles, length stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing something at ETS this year. So if anybody is interested in that, I don't know whether it will go in the ETS journal. Any of you members of Centre for Pastor Theologians? So yeah, I'm speaking for CPT actually in a couple of weeks' time on this. And actually, if any of you have who's read Susan Eastman's book, Paul and the Person? So that's a really interesting read. And I'm kind of dialoguing a bit with her in a paper for them. But I'm not a blogger. I don't write blogs, and I'm afraid I don't read them either. If I was better at that, then it would be out there, but it isn't.
But we've had this, which is great. So thank you very much, Neil. We'll draw it to a close there to keep our kind of